Coming up on this week's episode of Insight Weekly, the Intelligence Fusion team are discussing police brutality and race relations, providing analysis on the unrest we've seen in the United States since the murder of George Floyd, as well as the impact it's had on other countries and regions across the globe. Keep watching to find out more. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Insight Weekly. Today, myself and Vincent are back in the IF office and we're joined remotely by fellow analysts Chris, Max and Viraj. Following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis early last week, the United States has seen a surge in unrest, including protests, looting and riots across the country, calling for an end to police violence. In addition to taking a closer look at the incident itself, we also take a look at the impact that this has had on other regions and the activity we've seen in response in the UK, in the Middle East and Africa. We also look at patterns and incidents of police brutality and race relations in other countries too. If you'd like to make sure that you are one of the first to watch new episodes of Insight Weekly when they're released every single Friday, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Firstly, this week, however, Vincent is going to give us an overview of the death and what we've seen across North America in the last 7 days.
Yeah, absolutely. So in regard to the topic of police violence, police brutality, it'd be hard at the moment to talk about anything else but the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the incidents that have followed suit. So on the 25th of May, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis while being taken into police custody on suspicion of having used a counterfeit $20 bill at a store. During the arrest, a white police officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes, leading to his death. In the aftermath of the incident, the four officers involved were immediately fired, but protests erupted throughout Minneapolis, demanding justice and demanding charges be brought. These protests have later spread to what we're currently seeing. Protests are now recorded in every major city in the United States, as well as in many smaller ones. The protests have continued even after the police officer was charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. And as of yesterday, these charges have now increased to second-degree murder, and the three other officers have been charged with aiding and abetting murder. In regard to the protest, the majority have been peaceful, but often when night falls, small groups of protesters and some actors outside of a protest. So we've seen accusations of Antifa and even white supremacist elements being accused of being involved in inciting riots. They've perpetrated looting, arson, and even clashed with the police, which has significantly impacted the retail sector across the U.S., as many of the targets are shops like Target, which we've seen has now closed temporarily locations across the U.S. Due to incidents. We've seen varied responses from police departments across the country, with some joining in the protest, whether it be kneeling or marching with the protesters or just having dialogue with them. But we've also seen other departments take more forceful measures with protesters, even when those protesters have been peaceful. This has led to the firing of at least one chief of police and several officers across cities in the U.S., some for acts, again, caught on camera, showing the disproportionate use of force. Several arrests have shown officers using the same move, the knee on the neck, that we saw killing George Floyd. And we've also seen members of the press arrested and directly targeted by members of the police, as well as protesters themselves. The situation continues to be volatile, and we've seen looters, innocent bystanders, and police officers being killed or wounded within the violence following the death of George Floyd.
So this clearly isn't a isolated incident. There's been multiple cases like this before. How widespread is this?
Yeah, absolutely. The problem is that acts of police violence, and I'm sure not just in the U.S., as we'll later hear from you and the other analysts, are quite underreported. Much of the stats gathered often come from independent sources and aggregated by the likes of research projects within, say, the Washington Post or the Guardian. In 2019, more than 1,000 people were killed by police in the United States, averaging about 3 deaths a day. Now, not all these shootings were unjust, as that number also includes the shootings of suspects engaging police in shootouts or putting innocent lives at risk, where the use of deadly force was necessary. However, within that number, we do see the disproportionate use of force towards minority groups. So within that number, it's said that 24% of those killed were black individuals, despite black individuals making only 13% of the population within the United States. And this is why we see these protests led by groups like Black Lives Matter. It's that there's a disproportionality in who the victim of police actions are. And this is not new. It's been seen during the civil rights movement ever since the war on drugs was declared, which has disproportionately targeted minorities and the poor in large cities, as well as when the war on terror was declared. So now to wrap my section up, I want to bring it back to current events. It's likely that we'll see these protests continued as compared to previous protests after police shootings of an unarmed black man or child. There's significant momentum within this movement at the moment to produce real change. Now, what that change might be or how it will look is the big question. But I think that police departments, especially those who have registered more shootings, will come under greater scrutiny in the near future. Just this week, Representative Justin Amash introduced the Ending Qualified Immunity Act, which would allow civil lawsuits against police. So qualified immunity is said to be one of the big parts on why prosecution of police officers has been so difficult, as it protects them from certain lawsuits at the moment. So it'd be interesting to see whether that passes and whether more action is taken by not only the federal government but local governments to end the protest violence, police violence. I mean.
Okay, thanks, Vincent. So today there's multiple cases at the moment within the Asia region regarding police violence against normally protesters, including areas such as Hong Kong, in Iraq, with ongoing protests, and also in the Israel-Palestine area. But I'm going to focus on Israel-Palestine this week because there's been a recent incident in which a Palestinian man was shot and killed by Israeli police out near to a place called Lionsgate in Jerusalem. The incident itself picked up quite significant media attention. As details started to emerge, it started to become clear that an autistic man who misunderstood the commands to stop attempted to run away, and his mobile phone was later mistaken for a firearm, and he was shot and killed as close to the scene. So incidents such as these do occur in the West Bank and Israel as well fairly frequently, but this one's attracted particular attention and has actually caused some protests in Israel and the West Bank as well. This is partly because of the ongoing protests in the USA, and I think there's been some impact, and people have seen activism in other countries, and it's taken an impact in Israel as well. But also, the killing is being perceived as just the most recent incident in a long series of incidents such as these. And these protests have mostly been carried out by Palestinians in the West Bank, as well as Arab-Israeli communities, mostly in northern Israel. And whilst this incident is fairly common, it represents a broader theme within Israel, and that's the very poor relationship between Israeli police and at times military, between the Israeli military and police and Palestinians, as well as Arab Israelis living in Israel. So in the West Bank, we see very frequent operations carried out by Israeli security forces, and the majority of the time, these operations lead to heavy clashes with Palestinian protesters. And the Israeli police and military are very regularly criticised for their conduct during these clashes. Usually, they're quite quick to use weapons such as tear gas and rubber bullets in the West Bank itself. In northern Israel, there's much less clashes between police and Arab Israeli communities. However, the police relationship again comes in here because the Arab Israeli communities frequently accuse the Israeli police of not investigating violent crime carried out in the Arab Israeli communities. And whilst Israel is often perceived as a country of very low crime rate, gun crime in the north of the country is very common among the Arab Israeli communities, partly related to interfamily feuds and partly related to gang crime. And Israeli police have, as I've just mentioned, have been accused of doing very little to stop this and very little to investigate the shootings, of which there can at times be one every other day. Whilst this incident itself was a single incident, it's part of a broader theme, and Palestinians have attempted to bring this theme to the fore at the same time as US activism.
Max, what has been the significance in the cooperation between Israeli and US police?
Yeah, so we've seen in the news during these protests that US police have been cooperating with Israeli police, and the exact details of this are at times hard to find. But the US police departments essentially have been accused of taking advice from Israeli police that simply isn't applicable in the USA. So the Israeli police, who are frequently accused of the overuse of force, also come from a very different environment to the USA, and US police have now been accused of taking back these overly confrontational and overly violent methods from Israel and using them against US citizens in their own protests. So the actual extent of the support of the cooperation between the two countries' police is more of an ad hoc basis. So federal governments decide which police departments go, and some of this cooperation is just in the form of seminars and sharing of ideas, and other cooperation comes in the form of actual visits to Israel and delegations from US police visiting Israeli police. But again, this very much depends on the department, and some of these trips are privately funded and some of them are taxpayer funded. But again, I expect to see more reporting about the relationship between Israeli and US police as these protests in the USA continue.
Thank you very much, Max. And over to Chris this week with Europe. We've seen a lot of activity there. Can you tell us more about that, please, Chris?
The death of George Floyd has led to a rise of Black Lives Matter and anti-racism protests across the continent, with major European cities including Berlin, Hamburg, Madrid, Milan, Brussels and Copenhagen experiencing quite major protests. In the UK, such protests have been reported in cities including London, Cardiff, Bristol, Birmingham and Liverpool, with many more planned, as well as online petitions, specifically to MPs, and these include a demand to stop the sale of riot control equipment to the United States. And recent days have seen an escalation of these protests in London, with large crowds gathering in Hyde Park, while we have seen small outbreaks of violence, specifically outside Downing Street and along Whitehall. It's important to note that any violence that has been directed towards the police has been very limited, especially when compared to the US, and that officers have been successful so far in preventing any major escalations in violence. Indeed, the Met Police have so far permitted most of these mass gatherings despite the coronavirus regulations, with some officers openly supporting the demonstrators in similar fashion to some in America by, say, taking a knee. In fact, the UK Chief Constables issued a quite rare joint statement in which they condemned the violence in the US and declared their support for the right to protest, declaring it to be a vital part of a functional democracy. However, there have been instances of protesters attacking members of the press, specifically journalists who they claim worked for the Daily Mail, which is a right-wing newspaper in the UK, as well as an Australian 9 News crew. In the UK, while incidents of police brutality towards members of the BAME community are significantly less common compared to the US, there are major cases, even in the last few years, such as the shooting of Edson DaCosta in 2017 and Mark Duggan in 2011. Both of these led to violent protests. Furthermore, the police's failure to thoroughly investigate the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993 led to several decades of investigation into police misconduct and claims of institutional racism in the Metropolitan Police.
So, Chris, there have been reports in the media outlets in Mali where they reported rioting in France. Can you tell us more about that, please?
Of course. So France is also seeing a response to the death of George Floyd, with Black Lives Matter protests having been organised in Paris, and we have seen rioting, which was recorded on the night of the 2nd of June. The city has also seen thousands of demonstrators march in support of undocumented migrants, a social group who have often faced discrimination in France, resulting in 92 arrests. However, French police appear to have a much worse relationship with minority groups and have suffered from a rise in attacks on officers, as we discussed actually a few weeks ago, with officers frequently being attacked by rocks, bottles and fireworks. However, other more serious attacks have also occurred, such as a vehicular attack against an officer in Montpellier, and a police officer along with his son being attacked while off duty this weekend. Now, the reason I mention this is due to the fact that a great deal of these attacks against police occur in areas which right-wing commentators have referred to as no-go zones. and these zones tend to have high minority ethnic populations with whom the police have poor relations. This has been demonstrated this week, in fact, by the attack of a French police officer who was black, who was assaulted by protesters who claimed he'd sold out by joining the police. Now, these increasing levels of violence, along with other issues such as increased workloads, poor working conditions, and pay disputes, have led to what can only be described as a mental health crisis amongst French police. In this year alone, at least 15 officers have committed suicide, while an investigation in early 2019 found that, on average, one police officer would commit suicide once every 4 days. While France is perhaps the best example of a country struggling to maintain the balance between the government supporting its police, the police maintaining positive relations with the BAME community, and ensuring robust proportional policing, it is an issue that is faced all over Europe.
Thanks, Chris. So in Africa, the African Union, they released a statement condemning the killing of George Floyd. They rejected, in a statement, they wrote that they rejected continuing discriminatory practices against Black citizens of the United States. And in stark contrast with statements coming out of the US, such as by President Trump, US embassies called for greater accountability in policing in the US. African leaders also released similar statements, some of them using strong language. Comments made by the US National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, also caused anger in Zimbabwe after he accused Zimbabwe, along with China and Iran, of stoking unrest in the US using social media. There have been protests in front of the US embassies in Kenya and Liberia, though not like what we've seen in countries such as in Europe. Police or army violence has caused anger in Africa in recent days, such as in Mauritania, Nigeria, and Kenya, to name a few. Since state of emergencies have been declared and curfews have been imposed, there have been a number of protests linked to police violence, police killings, and shootings as well. Dozens have been killed across Africa by police enforcing COVID-19 measures, and there have been many protests linked to this. At least 12 people have been shot dead in Kenya by police enforcing the curfew, with dozens more wounded. In Nigeria, a Nigerian human rights organization reported in April that law enforcement officers killed more people than the COVID-19 did since the lockdown began. The use of heavy-handed tactics are common, and this actually spurs protests. In many cases, police have fired live rounds in the air, and some protesters have been killed, and this has an escalating effect.
So, Faraj, what are the implications for police violence, and would you say that there are any implications for the US in Africa?
Yeah, sure. So, given the attention of the death of George Floyd has brought in Africa, there are implications for the US in that they lose legitimacy, and I think they come across a bit as hypocritical. Unlike China, who put emphasis on the principle of sovereignty and they don't interfere, they make it a point not to interfere in other countries' domestic politics. In the US, there have been, they have criticized countries for their human rights record. It was last year, just that in Zimbabwe where they criticized police, for example, and rightly so, for attacking protesters. But also in Africa, police violence also generally has implications for policing in that it damages police-community relations and fuels distrust in police, especially in areas where such incidents have occurred. This can lead to people taking the law into their own hands through vigilantism, and it also impacts genuine police action against criminality. I think it also causes hostility towards police and increases attacks on police. For example, in the Ivory Coast, clashes between police and inhabitants is common in Yao, which is just east of Abidjan. There are implications for COVID-19 prevention and response to, in that anger at police killings have in Togo, for example, led to protesters, calling for the lifting of the curfew.
Thank you very much, Faraj, and thank you to all of the analysts today for their insight. Remember, if you're a client and you subscribe to our platform, you can check out the incidents discussed in today's episode by using the advanced filters. Just select tagged and start typing Insight Weekly to see the results. If you're not a client but you would like to take a closer look at the data and the reporting that supports our analysis, then you can visit the link in the description for a free demonstration. And don't forget to like, share and comment. Tell us your key takeaways and you may just feature on next week's episode. See you then.